Today I'm going to be knitting with some stretch sock yarn. This is Patton's cotton socks, and it has a significant amount of a stretchy fiber added to the cotton. It's very nice, but of course, like all sock yarns, it comes in a skein. It's a center pull skein, but I still find it better to rewind it and drop it in a pretzel container to keep it from jumping around. And then trim a neat hole, and I'm going to feed my yarn through that. I just want to show you how much stretch there is. It's a significantly stretchy yarn, and that will matter to what we're doing. I'm all threaded up. Please pardon the untidiness. And everything is normal. You might think for a stretchy yarn that you need to make wild adjustments in your tensioner, but actually it feeds just fine. I normally don't even have to change it from what I'd use for a similar yarn, but naturally you always swatch and check and see how it's working. There just is no substitute. And here we are doing normal stockinette knitting. I would like to point out one or two things. It knits just fine. I do tend to use weights generously while knitting with stretchy yarns to keep them from pulling the stitches back up, which is a tendency. Also, I normally find that enlarging the stitch size a little bit over what I would normally use for a similar weight yarn is helpful. This is a thin yarn. I might use 5, possibly 6 or 7 normally, but because it's going to pull in dramatically and because it's cotton and it's going to loft, as well as having the lycra have an effect on it, often I have to raise the stitch size to get results I like. It will knit a lot tighter, but the socks might feel like cardboard, which is not exactly what you want. Again, no cheating, you must swatch. Most socks, of course, involve ribbing, and the ribber knits these elastic yarns just fine also. I'm not having any trouble. As usual, I turned my stitch size down for the ribbing. And as usual, to determine the perfect and ideal stitch size, you're going to need to swatch. Now here's a trick. In order to set up for knitting your socks in the round, all the stitches have to go to one bed or the other. And then we pick up half of them and rotate them around. And intuitively, we tend to want to transfer them all to the main bed and then pick up half of them and rotate to the ribber. But because of the way our wrists are attached to our arms and hands, it's actually easier to go the other way. So off camera, I'm going to transfer the main bed stitches to the ribber and then pick them, half of them up, and rotate them around. So on our pretend sock, I've now finished some ribbing. Of course, nobody's feet are really this small, but I'm going to take half of the stitches and back up until I'm in the middle of the row by unknitting them, so that my yarn tail will be coming from the new edge of the sock. This will be probably the top of the foot. This will be the bottom of the foot. Back up a little so we get a little bit better focus. And here is the yarn tail coming off. So that's in its correct position. One technique that I often use is a slender circular hand knitting needle. To do this, I've already removed the weights from the work, and I'll put them back in a minute. But I'm trying to lift each of these stitches onto this slim needle. Time for me to get these loaded so as not to lose them. Drop them off in that sense and keep loading. As I said, waste yarn may also be used, or you may have a stitch holder that will do the job. Anything that will allow us to hold them and turn the fabric. This is the most tedious part of the whole thing. You must learn to just try to be patient and methodical and go take a break if your hands cramp and your eyes cross, because you'll have to start all over if you drop stitches here.
Or if your cameraman falls out.
That's right. I'll try to be faster than that. Okay, here they all are. Now at this point, I need to make sure my working yarn is out of the way. Don't get it tangled on my needle. So this is what we have. Stitches on these needles, and I've hung a weight on them so they don't jump around while I do this. But I do not have a weight yet on this portion of the fabric. I'm going to reach under and make sure it really is truly folded. And now I can start removing the stitches from the needle that's holding them, or whatever is holding them. If it's waste yarn or a slim enough one of these circular needles, you can actually pick them up with them still on it. Figured out a way to see what I need to see, and you need to see too, so I'm back. See the stitches going on? So is the cable for the yarn needle, I mean the circular needle, but we can get it off in a minute, or at least that's what I'm hoping. All right, I'm holding a little pressure against the stitches and pulling on the needle, and it looks like everybody's staying where I want them to stay. One of the advantages of this elastic yarn is that you have a little more flexibility in the stitches. There we go. Now it is time for me to hang a weight on the other side of the fabric. Now we're doing our tubular or circular rows, and it's doing just fine. I'll stop in a minute after knitting a little bit tubular and show you what the settings are. For all brands of machine, what you want is that one direction the ribber knits, or the front bed, and one direction the main bed knits. The ribber just knitted, so now we want the main bed to knit. Front, back, round, and round. Front, back, round, and round. And here's how we get it on a brother. One side is on N, one side is on partial knitting on the ribber, and these are the part buttons on the main bed, and you do the same thing, but it needs to be opposite of what the ribber is, because in this direction, going right, this will knit, and down here, going left, the N here means that will knit. On a passive, this is CX, and on studios, it usually is a matter of side levers. Sometimes they're positioned differently depending on the year. Let's do just a few more rows. And this is testing out a ribber, by the way, which is working just beautifully. Because I am testing out this ribber, I've swapped positions. You don't want to swap it in the middle of a real sock, because that is going to make a little hole in the fabric where the swap occurs. But it's not a concern for a test, and this way works just the same. Okay, here's my pretend sock. I didn't knit a heel, but we've got a finger-sized sock even before washing. That's 22 total stitches. Here's the ribbing, and here's how it transitioned to the sock. So you can see how nice that looks. Now I'm going to go measure it and show you what the gauge is before washing. At this point, right off of the machine, I have 8 stitches per inch, which is already a denser fabric than you would have predicted based on the stitch size I chose and the thickness of the yarn. So you can see the effect of the lycra in the yarn. But now I'm going to go wash the fabric and see what it does after that. Here's another very nice sock yarn with stretch. This one is an opal yarn that's 75% wool, 25% polyamide, and it knits also very well on the machine, although this particular one I loom knitted by hand. But you can see what a nice fabric it makes either way. Yarns like these tend to shrink more as they dry, so when you measure them mostly dry, you may get a surprise a couple hours later. This one's mostly dry, and it's already down to 8.4 stitches per inch, so you can see it is drawn in some. but I wouldn't make a sock decision based on it yet. Another yarn that behaves very much like these two is Cascade Fixation, but it's quite a bit heavier, and it needs to be run either on a mid-gauge or on the largest stitch sizes of a standard or a Passett machine. It's a very nice cotton lycra yarn. The stretch feature, lycra in particular, but many of the stretchy fibers are actually not fully activated until they have been washed and dried. Both the warmth and the wet have an effect on them. That's why swatching is so absolutely critical. It's always important, but with these yarns, more so than usual.